Paul Smith versus Arthur Abraham, the rematch. Interesting, this fight. I was one of those who didn't give Paul Smith much of a chance in the first fight, but I did actually score the fight in his favour. I thought Paul Smith did do enough to win. I think in the first fight we saw Paul Smith at his very, very best. I think that's as good as it gets for Paul Smith. I also think we saw an undermotivated Arthur Abraham, who potentially hadn't taken training as seriously as possible, putting in one of the worst performances of his career. Now, Paul Smith is a solid boxer. Across the board, he is decent. But in my eyes, this guy hasn't turned into an elite super middleweight overnight. He doesn't, for me, have eye-catching work. And I think that's a huge problem when going away, fighting away from home, on a rival promoter's bill, taking on a home fighter, taking on an existing world champion. You know, what Paul Smith doesn't do is land flashy combinations. What he doesn't do is have electric movement, foot movement or head movement. What he doesn't do is throw a punch that makes the audience gasp with how hard it looks. He just isn't, in my eyes, a very eye-catching fighter. I've just done a video on Martin Murray and Gennady Golovkin, and I think there's some similarity between the two. You know, Smith is solid across the board, but what does he actually bring to the table? Is his movement world class? No. Is his defence world class? No. Is his combination punching or power punching or inside game world class or body punching world class? No. He's solid across the board. Now, the reason I scored him the first fight was because of his activity. There were rounds where he was just the more active man. He had more outgoing work. His jab was more regular than Abraham's. And in rounds that were admittedly close rounds, I edged towards Paul Smith, because I thought his activity and outgoing work was more constant than Abraham's. What I would say is that night, despite the fact Paul Smith's activity was higher, it wasn't good enough to catch the eye of the judges. It wasn't good enough for them to score him rounds. Now, we have to assume in this fight Arthur Abraham knows the threat Paul Smith brings. We have to assume he's more motivated. It's a rematch after all. We have to assume he's trained hard. He expects the fight to go 12 rounds. So will Paul Smith be allowed to be the volume puncher as easily as he was in the last fight? Will he be able to throw his jab with such regularity? For me, I find that dubious. It's questionable even if he is allowed to use the jab and to be the active fighter if he wins anyway, because the judges just didn't seem to favour his work. But even if Paul Smith is allowed again to dominate in terms of volume, it seems very unlikely, in my eyes, that that'll be enough to get the job done. And I think the difficulty for Paul Smith is, I question at this elite level his versatility. He's not suddenly going to get into a war with Abraham on the outside. He's not suddenly going to become a defensive master. He's not suddenly going to develop huge punching power or break Abraham up on the inside. We saw what Paul Smith has got to offer at this level. Will it be enough a second time? I doubt it. I doubt he'll be allowed to be as active as he was in the first fight. And I must say, when Abraham did land, it was Abraham who was more eye-catching. His combinations looked more hurtful, more spiteful. If there's a knockout in this fight, I really don't see Paul Smith having the sting behind his punches to be the one with his hand raised. For me, if there's a knockout, it's Arthur Abraham. Let's not forget Paul Smith was the same guy who got knocked out by both George Groves and James DeGale. He can be stopped. He can be beaten up. And for me, Abraham looks the bigger puncher. His combinations are more eye-catching. His shots seem not only to be more heavier, but to have a bit more snap and a bit more speed behind them. I'm highly, highly doubtful Paul Smith will be able to put on as good a show as he did last time. And unfortunately, an Arthur Abraham win is a confident selection. I think all that Paul Smith brought to the game last time was volume and a constant jab. I think Abraham is certainly going to bring more the second time. He'd be a fool not to. And I just think Abraham's got a whole nother gear to go to from what we saw in the first fight. Whereas I don't think Paul Smith does. Unfortunately, despite the fact I scored Paul Smith the first fight, it's a confident selection that Arthur Abraham retains his belt. And I don't discount the stoppage. Let me know your thoughts.